Elizabeth Hofmann Verlag presents an unabridged reading of Amberflame by Lisa Hofmann. Narration by Brixton Text-to-Speech Software. For my children, who love dragons. Even the mean ones. This is Amberflame by Lisa Hofmann. Willa's feet were freezing beneath her blanket, but it wasn't the cold that kept her awake. She'd been feeding the flames in the hearth like her life depended on it, just to give herself something to do while everyone else in the tiny one-room cottage slept, or at least pretended to. The little ones deserved to be warm at night. Heaven knew there was a hard winter ahead. The past few days had already given them a proper taste of it, along with a high fever and a persistent cough. She made sure both children were snug beneath their covers and swung her legs out of the bed just as a polar gust cracked the rickety shutter of the window across from her. Swiftly, she covered the 5 paces to the window and glanced out. When she didn't see what she'd been hoping for, she pulled the shutter back toward the frame, but not all the way. Closing the window might have helped keep the heat inside the cottage and saved them some wood, but it was out of the question. She needed to be able to see outside from her side of the bed, and as long as her father couldn't afford glass for the windows, this particular shutter would just have to stay open at night over the next few weeks. At the other end of the room, Bertram stirred in his sleep, flipped over on his back, and snored like a boar digging for chestnuts in the thicket. She wondered how her mother put up with him. He was a good man, but he liked his liquor and often drank too much. He'd had nearly a whole bottle of elderberry blossom schnapps after their evening meal, and he'd done a lot of tone-deaf singing, yelling and ranting before he'd finally started snoring. Love had a way of making you deaf to things you didn't want to hear, and blind to things you didn't want to see, Willa supposed. When she was sure her mother had stopped crying and also gone to sleep, she crossed the creaking floorboards to the north-facing window once more to scan the forest on the opposite hillside. Again, nothing. Her heart sank, and she laid another log on the fire. A few parched pine sprigs that had lost most of their needles wilted away in a vase on the mantelpiece. Next to it, a winged angel roughly the size of a dove prayed silently. Her grandfather had carved the wooden statue for her when Willa had been little, trying to install some Advent cheer in the house. She missed him every time she saw it. Eventually, she decided to call it quits and shut the window all the way. It was getting too late, and she had to walk to Silverberg to work in the morning so they could afford the ham her mother had ordered for Christmas Day. It would be a long, cold trudge through the icy forest if she took the short route, and an even longer, colder one if she walked along the main road. One more moment, she told herself 2 or 3 times as she stood watching the pale moon journey across the night sky. Then, just as she was about to latch the shutter, the 3 lights she'd been waiting for flickered to life one after the other in the window of the hunting cabin on the other side of the narrow valley. Willa smiled, forgetting her weariness. She didn't hear Thomas leave his bed and startled when the little boy pushed up against her from behind, snaking his thin arms around her leg. His cheeks were too warm, and his nose was runny. She bent to pick him up, wiped his face with a damp rag, and put him back under the covers without waking his twin, Emma. "Go back to sleep and get well," she whispered. "You go away every night," Thomas mumbled, already half asleep again. "Not true," she said softly, wishing it was, and instantly feeling guilty for it. She kissed his forehead. "I need to fetch wood for the fire. I'll be back soon enough." He seemed satisfied and nestled into his pillow, sticking his thumb in his mouth. He was too old to be sucking his fingers, but she let him be. Their father scolded him for it too often, not realizing he was only augmenting Thomas' need for his soother every time he did. She pulled on her clothes, grabbed her shoes, and slipped outside without looking back. Her skin tingled from the icy air and anticipation, and her breath misted in front of her, forming ghostly shapes in the night as she tugged on her winter coat and pulled the hood up over her face. Then she hurried down the hill, cutting through a sparse hazel grove instead of taking the road that led past her father's house to the village in the valley. The shortcut brought her to Aliment Lot, a field that bordered on the low, crumbling cemetery wall just outside Alderbach. She hesitated before stepping out into the open, scanning the area, and trying to calm her breathing so she could listen for any sign of movement. There was no cover here, nowhere to hide, and the place itself gave her the creeps. Her biggest worry was the watchman up in the church belfry. On a moonlit night like this, Frank Bogner would have clear sight of Aliment Lot. The field, and the cemetery wouldn't be his main focus of attention, but the monotony of observing the same part of the sky due south and the endless hours until dawn would have him looking for distraction, if he was there and awake. Also, he was getting on in years, and he loved his schnapps as much as Bertram did. Willa watched the belfry for a while. When she didn't see any movement, she decided to risk it and scurried across the rime-white meadow, avoiding the pole in the middle and taking care not to step on the unmarked graves on her side of the wall. The souls of sinners slept beneath the unconsecrated, frozen soil here. They had to wait for their day of judgment, or so the pastor would have the decent people of Alderbach believe, just as he would tell them that everyone's fate was measured and written. Among the sinners on Aliment Lot was a widow whose 2 young children Willa had watched from time to time. The woman had hung herself after they died of the fever 2 years ago. In the grave beside hers lay an adulteress whose husband had 5 children out of wedlock. He'd thrown her out of the house with nothing but the clothes on her back on a cold day last January. They'd discovered her body in the woods a week later. Willa put wild roses, daisies, or forget-me-nots on both graves whenever she came by on summer nights, but nothing bloomed right now except for the frost on the window panes at the hunting cabin, so tonight she had no flowers to leave. She climbed over the wall to where the God-fearing people laid their dead to rest, hoping the gate at the other end of the yard wouldn't be locked again as it had the last time she'd been here. The wall on the village side was higher than it was toward the field and the woods, as though the living didn't like to be reminded of the deceased too often, even if the deceased happened to be decent people. When she reached the iron gate, she pulled so firmly on its frost-crusted handle, she almost landed on her behind when it swung back. The screeching sound of corroded metal sent a shiver down her spine. She was sure she'd woken half the village, and darted toward the nearest cluster of half-timbered buildings, ducking back into the shadows of a cluttered alleyway. Alderbach had a population of 330 souls, and when the nights grew longer and the days colder, people liked to talk. She could imagine what they'd be saying about her the next morning if someone saw her sneaking around at this hour. She waited for a moment, listening, observing, and then continued on her way. All was remarkably quiet, even at the Boar, the village tavern. The woodcutters sometimes drank late into the night here, and the stench of urine and feces from the mid-street gutter was overwhelming. She held her breath, trying not to step into anything as she went by. 3 buildings down from the alehouse, someone opened an upper-floor window, and Willa dipped behind a rainwater barrel. Swearing loudly, Matilda Cordwainer emptied a chamber pot out onto the street. A window in the house opposite opened, and a woman with a frilly nightcap appeared in the frame. It was Anna Potter, one of the chattiest women in the Vales. "People are trying to sleep," Anna said, irritated. "Child's coming," Matilda's said, "and it's probably a bit on the heavy side." "Well, you're a bit on the heavy side, dear. What do you expect?" Willa chuckled, and immediately clasped a hand to her mouth, hoping she hadn't been heard. "You're a great help," Matilda muttered. Anna huffed. "Want me to come over?" she asked without much enthusiasm. "Not yet. I'll need England if it isn't here by dawn." "As you please," Anna said, "but wake that lazy husband of yours to fetch her." I have bread to bake in the morning." Anna shut her window, and Matilda retreated into the house, still swearing like a sailor. When she felt it was safe, Willa scurried past, heading for the shallow river that dissected Alderbark. The village church was on the other side of the stream. She cast another wary glance up at the belfry but still couldn't see anyone. Bognor would probably doze through a war, she thought, edging toward the arched bridge. Ice coated the worn flagstone pavement and glinted in the moonlight. She held on to the parapet, but her feet kept sliding out from under her, and she was glad when she was back on the frozen dirt road beyond. Passing the church, she heard Bognor mumbling in his sleep and quietly wished him sweet dreams that lasted until she was back in her own bed. A dog lay on the stoop in front of the carpenter's house. It looked up at her, wagging its tail when she approached, and she patted its head. The hound licked her fingers and gladly took the bite-sized bit of sausage she'd brought for it. The village bakehouse still smelled of the spelt loaves that had been in the big oven the day before. Its brick chimney was warm, and no frost had settled on the shingles of its roof. Her mother would be relighting the fire in the oven the next morning, and 10 more women would take their turn at baking the bread they'd need for their families' meals over Christmas. A little further up the road, a dim light shone in the midwife's ramshackle cottage, but there was hardly a way around it unless she cut straight through the brush, so Willa stayed on the road. Ingund had already seen her anyway. The old woman crouched in her doorway, softly talking to a cat that slunk around her legs. Willa briefly considered turning around, but then decided she had nothing to fear. Ingund was ancient, and she didn't waste her time spreading rumors, though by way of her profession, she was probably the best informed person in the 12 villages. "You're up late, Willa Goodfellow," the midwife said, straightening, and pulling her woolen shawl tightly around herself. "So I am," Willa replied, flashing her a bright smile. "And I have no excuse." There was no point in lying. Ingund wasn't stupid. The old woman seemed baffled at her brashness but didn't follow up. She could probably guess where Willa was going. The midwife might have seen her come by this way after dark before. God knew she'd been up and down to the hunting cabin at least once a week since summer. "Matilda's baby is coming," she offered, breaking the awkward silence. "She might send for you in the morning." "Good to know," Ingund said. "I'll go and see her first thing." She smiled at Willa kindly. "You take care now." Then she turned and went back inside with not 1, but 3 cats on her heels. People around here thought she was crazy for feeding them and letting them into the house. Cats were said to be bad luck, and most folks in Alderbark killed any strays they found wandering around the woods. Willa didn't much care for that particular practice. Animals couldn't be good or bad, or sway fortune in either direction. They were what they were. Shivering, she continued on her way. The hunting cabin perched on a natural terrace near the top of the hill, and by the time she got there, her feet were numb, but she was giddy as a child. It was balmy inside the little cabin. Aberlin had lit a fire and sat cross-legged by the open hearth, absently stoking the flames when she quietly slipped inside. He only became aware of her when she dropped to her knees beside him. The smile on his face never ceased to make her heart miss a beat, and the world outside the cabin was forgotten. Without a word, he enveloped her in his warmth and kissed her lips. Life was good. She let him undress her and lead her to the bed with the beautifully carved headboard and the fragrant embroidered sheets where she'd decided in summer that he would be her first and only man. Aberlin had been her best friend, and now he was her lover. Whenever they were together, she felt like a queen. He was gentle and giving, and she never doubted him when he whispered that he loved her more than his life. He touched her as though she was precious and breakable, and he treated her with more respect than anyone else had ever done. Sometimes, They went walking together in the woods behind the cabin after dark, and he told her of his hopes and dreams. At least those he had for the villages over which his father's castle held vigil. He asked for her opinion on matters that were important to him and listened to what she had to say. He made her laugh with his silly stories about the padre who tried to teach him Latin up until last year, the cook's antics in the castle kitchen, or Wildflower, his favorite horse. He didn't speak unkindly of others, and she adored his incorrigible optimism. The one thing they didn't talk about was their relationship. She was only part of his life by night while the Vales slept. He would never ask her to marry him, and she wouldn't lead him to believe she wanted him to. Marriage hadn't been a likely option at the best of times, and then, two things had happened. The first of them was that Abelin's elder brother had gotten himself killed. Jacob's death had crushed her tentative girl's fantasy of a future with Abelin because it meant that he was now his father's sole heir. Any night she spent with him could be their last, depending on how quickly his mother managed to find a good match for him. Despite the crushing effect Jacob's death had on her, Lady Galinda had retained her soft-spoken manner and compassion for the needy. She no longer left the castle quite as often as she used to, but Lord Emmanuel valued her advice, and her cleverness and foresight commanded respect in the Vales. Any girl of noble birth might gladly consent to the connection with Abelin, knowing this was part of the prize. Willa's only consolation was her certainty that Galinda wouldn't let just anyone have him. He was her last living child, and she would want someone for him, who would eventually shoulder her burden, run the castle, and have his back without question or complaint. A woman of standing who would give him children to bear his name and inherit the lands Galinda's forefathers had fought and died for. Someone whose hands were never chafed when she stroked his beautiful face, and whose feet were never cold. Willa hoped Lady Galinda would choose someone kind and loving. The moon moved across the clear sky like a rider on a mission, and she knew they didn't have much time left before dawn would awaken the little village and her parents would find her gone. The 3 tallow candles in the window had burned to tiny stumps because they'd been short to begin with, and the fire in the hearth had died. She turned in Abelin's arms and found him studying her. "We should run off," he said unexpectedly. Her spine tingled. "And then what?" "I should run off," she said out loud instead of just thinking it. "Are you sorry you met me?" She wasn't, but she didn't want this conversation. Not tonight? It would make her heart heavy, and she had no use for a heavy heart. "Of course I am," she told him, dead serious. "Look at me, naked and freezing after being ravished by the Vale's tyrant lord in the woods. How will I ever get over this and lead a normal life again?" His face went blank, and she burst out laughing, hoping he'd laugh along with her and save her. Save them both. It took him half a heartbeat to comprehend that she was pulling his leg, or trying to. For one horrible moment she thought he would be mad at her. Finally, he ventured a grin, but he was a bad actor, and it was the saddest grin she'd ever seen. "I'm sorry," she said, and coaxed him to roll over, pinning him down beneath her. She brushed a stray strand of golden hair from his brow and fixed her gaze to his. He was all warmth and hard muscles, nothing like she'd expected a blue-blooded second son to feel like before she'd felt his body on hers for the first time. The scent of fresh hay and apples clung to his skin, and memories of an azure summer sky danced in his eyes whenever he laughed. Oh, how she wished he'd just followed her lead, and laughed at her bad joke now, but she should have known him better. He'd been a part of her life for over 2 years, and she still didn't know what to expect from him. "I'm sorry," she repeated, caressing his cheek. "I love you." That had to be enough. She couldn't give him anything more, and she couldn't take anything from him either. She had no right to him. His fingers traced the line of her jawbone, and he pulled her to him. His lips tasted of honey on pine sprigs, and she ached from longing for him. He could have left the bed and the cabin instead of kissing her, but he was still here, and it was almost unfair. Life was never fair in the Vales, and yet they were together. For now? She stroked and kissed every inch of him, and they made love again, but his words kept reverberating in her mind, and the sad look in his eyes would not give her peace. Things would be different between them next time they saw each other. If there was a next time. She watched him sleeping for as long as she dared to stay afterward, wishing she had nowhere to be in a few hours, and took care not to wake him when she got dressed and pulled on her shoes. The stars were already waning, and a grey, hungry dawn lurked just beyond the horizon in the east. A heavy weight bore down on her shoulders, slowing her as she made her way back toward the village. For the first time in her life, she felt a little sorry for herself. Shivering, she bent to stroke one of Ingun's cats when she reached the midwife's house, and a dark shadow passed directly overhead. Her heart stopped. Amberflame. Bogner was likely still asleep. Who'd raise the alarm? Who'd warn everyone? Silently gliding down from the hill, the crimson dragon was so close, its mighty horn-tipped wings whispered against the treetops. It was a wonder the beast didn't see Willa on the narrow road below. Ingun's cat disappeared into the undergrowth, and Willa froze, unable to move, unable to breathe as she listened to the hoarse sound of Amberflame filling her lungs with air as she slowed her advance. Then, a bellowing roar shattered the night, and the sky lit up as the dragon's first firebolt hit the church belfry, killing the slumbering guard. The little steeple exploded in a red-hot blast, and burning debris rained down on the bridge. A molten clump of iron, the remains of the bell, came down in the river with a thud, smashing the ice on the water's surface. At last, Willa came to her senses and bolted, arms up to protect her head. She took cover behind the woodpile Ingun kept beside her cottage. Why was this happening? Why tonight? The dragon rose, doubled back, and dipped once again, spewing another gush of flaming bile at the church. The force of the flare took what remained of the roof clean off, and the whole building was ablaze. Amberflame ascended and circled. Moments later, another explosion ripped through the air, but Willa couldn't see where. There was too much smoke, and it bit into her lungs. Something touched her shoulder, and she screamed, realizing a second later that it was only Ingun. Deathly pale, barefoot, and in her nightgown, the old woman looked like an apparition. "Come on," the midwife yelled, dragging her to her feet. "We have to get away from the house." Willa knew she was right, but at the same time, doing so probably played straight into the dragon's strategy. Amberflame destroyed buildings to draw as many people as possible out into the open, where they would either become easy targets or get to watch the carnage. Willa moved through the trees, following Ingun as though in a dream, running for her life without feeling the soles of her feet touching the ground. The sensation only wore off when they reached a rocky alcove some way into the forest and she regained some sense of direction. The alcove was protected from three sides, and a cluster of two densely grown young beeches and bare hazel bushes provided cover near the opening. The narrow cavity in the hillside had once served as one of two entrances to a silver mine that had collapsed over a century ago. It had been blocked so children wouldn't wander inside, but the honeycombed earth was always shifting here with the autumn rains and the winter storms. A gap in the wall had widened sufficiently to allow the two women to crawl inside one after the other just as the dragon's next blast of fire hit. For a second, golden shafts of light speared into the mine's entrance, illuminating the claustrophobic space around them. They both knew the monster had aimed for Ingun's house. The only other building this far up on the hillside was the hunting cabin near the top. Willa's stomach lurched. "No," she whimpered. She was about to turn and inch back out the way she'd come, but Ingund grabbed her around the waist. "Don't!" the midwife hissed. "Stay here." "Let me go." Willa's eyes filled with tears. The cabin wasn't far, and she had to warn him. She'd be there in no time if she scampered straight up the slope instead of taking the path, but Ingund didn't have to tell her that this would be suicide. 5 years ago, the dragon had destroyed one of the farmhouses on the other side of the village, and everyone in the building had died either in the fire, or in the moments afterward. A maid had tried to escape into the woods. Amberflame had picked the girl up like a rag doll and torn her to pieces. The farmer's youngest son made it to the river, badly burned, only to drown because no one dared come to his aid. They'd found him face down in the water along with 3 other bodies after the beast had gone. 5 people died during the attack that night, but the dragon had not eaten even one of them. Amberflame only fed when she was hungry, and she certainly had been hungry, but she liked to taunt them and play with them if one of the Vale's communities refused to give her what she wanted. She always made them choose. Tonight, the dragon should not have been anywhere near here. Not if she'd gotten her aliment in Tannenberg the previous night. Something must have gone wrong. Perhaps Tannenberg's designated sacrifice had absconded at the last moment, or they just refused to send someone's daughter, mother, or sister to the field where the dragon would devour her, and now Audiobook would have to pay the price. Willa's heart thumped madly in her chest, and all the warmth and goodness she'd taken with her from the cabin evaporated in the icy air. How many would Amberflame kill tonight? Whose mutilated bodies would they find strewn around the valley in the morning? Abelin would have been safer at the castle. Had it not been for her, he'd have been asleep in his own bed. He'd have been out of harm's way. She made another attempt to reach the opening, and again Ingund held her back. "Don't be stupid," the midwife said. "You don't have a chance? You don't understand?" Ingund pressed her against the rock wall with all her strength. "I understand better than you think." Willa shook her head and struggled, but Ingund didn't let go of her. "I know Abelin is up there," she said. "I care about him, too." Willa found this strange. It stood to logic that the old biddy was aware of his presence in the cabin, and she had to assume that he and Willa were lovers, but why should she know him well enough to care about him? No one in the Vales cared about the people who lived up at the castle on the next hill. Many of them blamed the nobles for the misfortune that had befallen the villages. Those who had seen the battlefields and fought side by side with their lord in their king's last war understood the price of their artificial safe haven. Those who remained at home had no idea. Willa struggled. "What do you know of Abelin?" "He was born on a night exactly like this, and I nursed him and his brother when Lady Galinda couldn't. Jacob and he both drank from my breast for nearly 2 years, so don't go assuming you are more entitled to a concern for his safety than I." Ingund sounded so upset, Willa didn't doubt she was telling the truth. Only she wouldn't have thought Ingund could still have nursed a child 18 years ago. She looked much too old to have cared for an infant even 40 years ago, but Willa realized that she knew very little about Ingund. "Look," the midwife continued, cautiously letting go of Willa, "neither of us can help him now. He's smart. He will have left the cabin as soon as he grasped what was going on, and it won't do to put yourself in danger. Calling to him would bring him out into the open, looking for you. You'd both be in danger then. We're going to stay put until this is over. It's the best we can do." And they did. 3 more explosions shattered the early hours of December 23rd, and the screams they heard made Willa want to cover her ears. She didn't think she recognized any of the shrill, desperate voices, and prayed that none of them belonged to one of her parents, or the twins. With Bertram drunk, it would have been up to her mother to get everyone out of the house. She should have been there to help her bring the children to safety. Perhaps this was her punishment for all the times she'd lied to and deceived her family, her punishment for loving the wrong man. Eventually, day came. The screaming stopped, and the dragon was gone. Willa crawled outside and glanced around, joints stiff, mouth dry. The smell of foul eggs and burned meat hung in the air, and she bent over, retching until she was able to steady herself well enough to make a decision. "Go and look for Aberlin," she told England. "I have to see if my family is unharmed." She ran all the way, past the smoking ruin of Ingund's home, the ashen remains of the bakehouse and the church, and through the village centre of Alderbark, where the boar and the 2 houses on either side of the inn had burned almost to the ground within less than an hour. People were dousing the smouldering skeletal frameworks with water from the river, as well as the walls and roofs of the neighbouring buildings to make sure the remaining heat didn't set them on fire. Hot embers still carried on the wind, fluttering like cherry petals in May, only they were black instead of white. 6 hastily covered bodies lay lined up along the street. Willa was astonished there were so few. She hesitated for a moment, staring at a charred foot peeking out from under a quilt, and then grabbed someone by the arm. "Tell me, do you know who that is?" She pointed at the body, but couldn't look the man in the eye. He shook her, and his face came into focus. She recognized her mother's older brother. Arthur Tice was one of the village elders, and he was helping to carry the buckets from the river. "Where have you been, girl?" he said. "Angela's half crazy. They're searching the woods for you." She nodded at him and pointed at the burned remains again. The man's size matched Aberlin. "It's Christian Potter. Anna, and the children are safe. The beast got Harold and Joseph a bricklayer, Agnes Hofmann, Frank Bogner, and Alexander, the boy who was helping Johann Ackermann on the farm down on the Silverberg Road. No one knows why he was out here. Maybe visiting his beloved," Willa thought, and crossed herself. Mouthing a thank you, she headed for the cemetery. Her family had survived, and Aberlin probably had, too. Somewhere, a newborn baby cried. Matilda's child. The sound eased the hot knot in her stomach. She found her parents' cottage untouched, and the twins inside, sleeping. A neighbor helped her call off the search in the woods, and when her parents returned, they had a lot of questions. Most of them were difficult to answer. Around noon, Tice's eldest son came to inform them about a meeting in the village center. A small paved area there served as a market square twice a year. Everyone was expected to attend. The dragon would return after dark, and there were decisions to be made. Willa knew what that meant. They bundled up the children, sat them in a hand cart, and immediately headed for the village to hear what the elders would have to say. Many of the people who came had to stand on the muddy street because the square would not accommodate them all. The voices of men and women, young and old, the freshly bereft, and those who'd already learned to live with their losses over the years blended into a hum that steadily rose until the elders arrived. Lord Emmanuel was with them, and he'd brought Aberlin. Relief washed over Willa. It must have shown on her face, because she suddenly felt her mother's arm around her shoulder. "I'm glad he's unhurt," Angela whispered. "Quiet. Please," Tice called. "We have much to discuss." Soot still clung to his coat, and his hands and face were filthy. He looked as tired as Willa felt. "Lord Emmanuel?" Bertram said before Tice could welcome them. "I hope you're here to help, and not just to make pretty speeches again." Both Tice and Emmanuel cast him an irritated glance. "I know you've all had a lot to contend with these past years," Emmanuel said, looking at him directly, "but we can find a way to resolve this situation." resolve this situation. A man who just joined them said, taking his place among the elders. It was Zacharias Hofmeyer. We lost our friends, neighbors, and relatives last night. We want to know what happened. Emmanuel patted his back. I sent my steward to Tannenberg this morning. He confirmed what the Honorable Tice told me most of you already suspected. There was trouble 2 nights ago, and no aliment was offered. And so we pay, and pay, and pay again, Robert Cordwainer shouted. We have 6 deaths to mourn, and 10 are injured. For the umpteenth time, Willa wondered what kind of trouble the people of Tannenberg had run into. Had their aliment fled, or had someone decided to fight back? Like Jacob had? Doubtful they'd hear the whole truth from Emmanuel today, she looked at Abelin and found him staring straight back at her. She couldn't read what she saw in his eyes, but it wasn't any kind of accusation or anger. Perhaps she would have a chance to speak to him later, though her father probably wouldn't let her out of his sight again today. Let Tannenberg send someone. Matilda called, getting ahead of Tice. She stood next to her husband, holding her new baby in her arms. With 5 children in the house now, Willa was sure the cobbler's wife was scared to death that her husband or she might be chosen next. One more baby, and the elders would take them both out of the pool. Children under the age of 14 and parents of 6 and more children were exempted, though Willa had no idea whose not-so-clever mind had come up with that number. 5 orphaned children were just as apt to starve as 6, when their remaining guardians' means were exhausted. And we also demand reparations for the families of the victims, Tice said. Emmanuel turned to him. I'll make sure they receive them. But that won't solve the bigger problem, Hofmeyer said. A murmur went through the crowd. The elders seldom spoke up against their lord, but Hofmeyer had everyone's sympathy. His grief was almost choking him. Emmanuel looked taken aback, but Willa didn't think he was truly surprised. The trust had been broken, again. 5 years ago, Milbach had failed them, and last night, Tannenberg had done it again. Although he couldn't protect the 12 villages against the demands of the dragon, a lot of people believed Emmanuel should at least protect them against each other and punish those who broke the rules of their arrangement, if their shortcomings harmed the other villages. But Willa knew this wasn't how it worked. Emmanuel had to uphold his end of the pact to the letter, or his days as Lord of the Vales were counted. I said I'd never get involved in the choosing process, and I won't, Emmanuel declared. No von Alderbach ever did, and I won't start. You said a lot of things. A young man who'd been friendly with Alexander shouted, rising above the other voices. What is it you demand of me? Emmanuel said then. If he sent soldiers to make sure the aliments were on location in the Vales villages every full moon night when the dragon came, it wouldn't be long before people would fear him, and not the dragon. Why doesn't he ever provide an aliment? Matilda's eldest daughter muttered. Willa turned to her. She and Ruth had played together as children. They lost a son last year. Ruth cast her a derogatory glance. But it's not like they sacrificed him. He died trying to kill it. Frank Bogner's grandson cut in. The beast is loyal to the Lords of the Vales, he told Willa, as though he was speaking to an ignorant child from anywhere but here. Emmanuel could just order it to stop killing us. He doesn't because it's his way of keeping us in line, if you ask me. Willa decided not to argue because you couldn't win an argument with an idiot, but Bertram had overheard what the lad said and clipped him on the ear. Young fool. You know nothing? Bertram had no great love for the family, whose ancestor gave this village its name, but he'd fought alongside Lord Emmanuel against the last great army that had tried to overrun the kingdom. He'd told Willa what the dragon could do on the battlefield, but he'd also told her that Amberflame wasn't allegiant to Emmanuel's family in the way that someone who hadn't seen her in action might assume. Amberflame was a killing machine 100 times more effective than the black powder the king imported from Asia nowadays, but she killed for 2 reasons only: to protect her territory, and to feed. The Vales were her territory, and had it not been for the dragon, the 12 villages that were right in the path of the Eastern Empire's mercenaries would have been razed to the ground during the war. Emmanuel raised his hands to command attention, and most of the talking ceased. I will say it again, I won't involve myself in the choosing process. That is the duty of your elders. It always was. But I will make sure Tannenberg sends the aliment before sundown, by force if necessary, this one time. We're grateful for that, my lord, but it's your duty to keep the peace in the Vales, Hofmann insisted, casting Tice a sideways look. And we must ask you to continue to do so now that we've had not 1, but 2 breaches of the agreement in the past years. Both times, our village has paid the price, and we want real compensation. Emmanuel's stare became as icy as the air. I do appreciate that Aldebark has been unduly burdened, and I assure you, I will see to it that the people of Tannenberg will live up to their responsibility. I don't know what more I can do. A few Alderbachers nodded, apparently satisfied, but most remained silent, waiting to hear how Tice or Hofmeyer would respond. The twins fussed, and Willa gave them a piece of hard bread each to busy them. Tice shifted his weight from one foot to the other and rubbed his stubbly chin. His gaze briefly met Willa's before he spoke. We want more. Our next aliment would be due in January. We want Tannenberg to provide a replacement so our village can recover without suffering yet another loss so soon after this disaster. This time, shouts of agreement rang out. Again, Tice glanced at Willa. Her stomach clenched, and her expression derailed for an instant. Abelin's eyes widened when he saw the exchange between them, and he said something into his father's ear. Emmanuel took Tice aside, and he, Tice, and Abelin spoke quietly. Their words were drowned out by the excited chatter all around. Would they choose a new aliment for November then, or would it still be whoever was picked for January? Ruth mumbled, not aiming the question at anyone in particular, but the boy next to her suspected that the person would remain the same. Once you're chosen, your days are numbered, he said. But Tice never tells. Only he and Hofmeyer know. I wonder who it is, Angela whispered to Willa. Poor soul hasn't said a word to anyone. Willa dared not look at her. It didn't feel safe. She didn't think she could look at anyone right now. Tice had broken the news to her in spring so she could make peace, say her goodbyes, and live life deeply until then, as he put it. He'd been devastated, but there would be no special treatment for the family members of an elder in Aldebark, or anywhere else in the Vales. She was his favorite niece, and the best advice he had for her was not to squander the months that remained of her life, and prepare herself. She had prepared throughout the summer, in a way, working hard and enjoying the sunshine whenever she didn't have to work. She'd taken Thomas and Emma to the lake on warm days, and she'd walked in the woods with Abelin, and allowed their friendship to become more. Loving him had been living life deeply. But she had only planned on telling her parents after Christmas. She didn't want them to suffer longer than necessary. Bertram had cried for days when they'd buried 2 of her siblings, children born before the twins, and sick with dysentery before they were strong enough to survive the illness. That was when his drinking had gotten really bad. Parents shouldn't have to bury their children. It wasn't fair. To no one. Willa's gaze wandered to Abelin once again. He looked distraught and seemed to be arguing with his father. Had Tice told them? Panic churned in her bowels. Hofmann carried out the thankless task of drawing the names of the elements from the village's church register, and her uncle had the duty to witness it. Both were sworn to secrecy for as long as the element chose to keep it that way. Some elements made one big celebration of their last months, while others sank into depression and stopped living before they actually died. Either way, the whole village partook in their fate, and Willa had decided this was not for her. Her fate was her business, and no one else's. She made Tyson Hofmeyr promise to keep their mouths shut until she was ready. She wanted to be the one to tell Bertram and Angela, and she wanted to choose the day and time, but the anguish on Abelin's face told her Tice had broken both his oath to the people of Audiobook as well as his promise to her. What was he playing at? He would lose his standing in the village if he tried to wiggle her out of this. Of course she wanted to live, even if it was only for another few months more, but not at someone else's expense. Time was precious. For everyone. The Tannenbergers had done them wrong, yes, but no one should have to die in her stead. Not a father or mother of 5. Emmanuel beckoned for silence. People of Audiobook, he called out, there is no good solution to this problem. I will do as I promised, and the Tannenbergers' element will be here to still the beast's hunger tonight. The victims of this tragedy will receive full compensation, but my decision is final. We will not change the course we're on. He paused, to let this sink in, then added, God willing, everything will go back to normal soon. Then, he turned and mounted the horse his squire held ready, followed by Abeline. Abeline glanced back at Willa twice, and twice she felt her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces because she was sure he was going to do something stupid. Let's go home? Bertram said, picking up the little cart's tow bar. Willa held Angela back to give him a few strides head start as the crowd slowly dispersed. Mother, there's something I need to do, she said. Angela was about to protest, but Willa had already decided she wasn't going to let anything stop her. She needed to go after Abeline, and she wasn't above lying to Angela. If only her parents knew him, and if he had been anyone but Emmanuel's son, they would never have objected. Ingun's house was destroyed last night, and she asked me to help her find her cats. They were scared and ran off into the forest, she said. Angela frowned, scrutinizing her, but then slowly nodded. All right. But hurry home. I don't want you out after dark. I'll hurry, Willa said, hugging her. I love you. Angela stared at her for a moment, bewildered, and Willa immediately regretted her words. When was the last time she'd told her mother that she loved her? A year ago. 2. Bertram had already turned back, but Angela snagged him by the arm and hustled him up the street, telling him God knew what. Willa didn't care, as long as she was free to go, and so she ran, despite the egg-sized lump in her throat. She hurried over the bridge and headed uphill. The shortest way to the castle was through the woods behind the hunting cabin. Ingund was going in the same direction, calling to her cats. Stop! She cried, when she spotted Willa. No time, Willa replied, rushing by, but Ingund broke into a sprint and grabbed her. Willa, please. He's going after it, Willa told the old woman. Bone-weary and upset, she could barely see because the smoke still stung in her eyes. Ingund pulled her into an embrace. Hush, child. Why would he do such a thing? Willa allowed herself to catch her breath, and then wiped her tears away, stepping back from the old woman. He knows I'm the next element. Ingund opened and closed her mouth a few times. I'm so sorry. Are you sure? Willa nodded, and resumed her uphill march. He thinks he can protect me. I have to stop him. Ingun struggled to keep up. "You're right," she said. "But you're going to need help." Willa didn't know how the old woman would assume to help her. She suspected Ingun was just playing for time, so she walked faster, but Ingun managed to keep up until they reached the hunting lodge. There wasn't much left of the building, but somehow the stable behind it had survived. Its walls were scorched, but the structure and roof was still intact. The double-winged doors stood wide open. Aberlin must have either set Wildflower free before the dragon had torched the place, or escaped the inferno on her back, risking that the beast would perceive the mare's movement between the trees. "Please wait," Ingun begged, grabbing her arm. "There's something I have to show you." She gestured at the stable. "I don't have time." What was the old bat thinking? "You need to come with me and look. I really can't help you, not just to find Aberlin, but to kill the dragon." The tone of the midwife's voice made Willa halt. Maybe Aberlin kept something in his father's stable besides his horse. Weapons that could pierce Amberflame's scales. Armor. Magic. Hope lit up like a candle in her heart. But then, wouldn't Aberlin have long since made use of anything that could kill a dragon if he were in possession of it? Wouldn't his brother have? Jacob had died fighting Amberflame, and Aberlin would too, if she didn't stop him. He'd ride out and look for the dragon's lair, and Willa had no idea where he'd begin, so she had to catch him while he was still at the castle. "What are you talking about?" she asked Ingund. "Dragons can't be killed." "True," the midwife said, "but humans can. Which is why I have to stop Aberlin." Ingund threw her head back in dismay. "Willa, if you want to save him, you're going to have to kill Amberflame. And you can, because she's human by day, and on nights when the moon isn't full." Willa halted in her tracks and spun around. "You're crazy." Ingund didn't know what she was saying. Dragons were dragons, not human by day. They slept in caves and came out at night to do whatever it was they did when they weren't terrorizing villages and feeding on humans. "Please," the midwife begged. Willa shuddered. What if Ingund was right? "Whatever it is you want to show me, do it quickly." She cast one last glance up at the path that would have led her to the castle within half an hour if she managed to hold her speed, and then followed the midwife. The stable wasn't very large. It had a window at the back, barred to keep out anything bigger than a rat. A pile of straw occupied the space below. Ingund retrieved a fork and started pitching the bedding to one side. Willa couldn't bear to watch the old woman toiling, and fetched another fork to help her. When they had cleared most of the pile away, Ingund went to her knees and pulled aside a tarp that had been spread out on the floor underneath, revealing a sturdy trapdoor. "What is this?" Willa asked. "A shortcut to the castle." Ingund smirked. "Aberlin's not the first ruler of the Vales to bring a lover here." She cleared the dust off the ring and twisted it, pulling at the same time. The hatch was too heavy for Ingund, and Willa lifted it for her. Its rusty hinges moaned. It hadn't been opened in a long time, and something told her Aberlin couldn't have known of its existence. Beneath it, a stairway led into the darkness. Willa remembered seeing an oil lamp hanging on a nail by the door. She fetched it and frantically searched for something to light it with, but before she could do anything further, the lamp lit up by itself. All at once, her mouth felt dry. So there really was magic here. "Stands to reason, doesn't it?" Ingund said softly, as if she could read Willa's mind. Willa retreated from her. "Don't be afraid. I'm on your side. I want to help you, and I want to help Aberlin. Please let me." "I don't know you anymore," Willa said. That's all right. I know you. And I know you want Aberlin to live. You were ready to die for us all, and I can't think of anyone who's braver than you, so be brave one more time and trust me. Trust was a fragile commodity, and it always came with a price if it was broken. Generations of people from the Vales had been brave before Willa had even been born. Brave for their people, so the dragon would protect them in times of war. The fact that Amberflame fed on them in times of peace had never seemed negotiable. Not since one of the beasts that had gone before Amberflame had destroyed the Vale's 13th village over 100 years ago when they'd tried to trap and kill her. Why should I do that? Willa said. Because I know who Amberflame is by day and where she is now, and I'm willing to share that knowledge so you can kill her. But you must swear one thing to me. Willa shook her head. If what you say is true and you know her identity, her weakness, why haven't you told anyone and put a stop to this madness? Ingun's brow furrowed, and sorrow settled into the lines around her eyes. I made a promise. Many, many years ago. She paused, fidgeting. To my brother. And what's making you go back on it now? The old woman dabbed at her eyes with the back of her hand. He knew the truth about the woman he loved, and he accepted it, kept it a secret. But he wouldn't have wanted this. Jacob is dead, and Aberlin will be too, if Amberflame isn't stopped. I couldn't live with myself. Willa made up her mind to riddle the midwife again later. If there was a later. All right. What is it you want me to swear? I want you to swear you'll kill the beast, and never reveal her true identity to Aberlin or any other living soul. Willa was willing to kill any kind of beast for Aberlin, but even if she knew the monster's human face and where to find her, no one could kill a dragon. Least of all she? Or could she? She didn't even have a sword. At best, she'd make it to the castle by use of the hidden passageway Ingund was showing her, and keep Aberlin from trying to go after Amberflame. If she could accomplish this, she'd walk out on Almond Lot with her head held high when the time came. It was the best she could hope for, but she decided to play along, praying that the old woman couldn't really read her thoughts. I won't tell anyone. That seemed good enough for Ingund. Follow me, the old woman said, and descended the narrow stairway. Willa lost count of the steps they went down into the earth, and she could only guess the distance they covered in the underground tunnel with the flickering lamp as their only guiding light. She guessed this must have been part of the network of silver mines that had once made the Vales so valuable to the king. Countless times, the passageway forked, and she lost track of the left and right turns they took before they came to a vertical shaft. Inside, one ladder above the other was fastened to the rock wall leading upward. It rose up so high, Willa couldn't see its end. I don't think I can make it up there, Ingund said. Willa held the lamp to her face. It was a miracle she'd gotten this far. The midwife didn't look like she could even make it back to Alderbark. Where exactly does this go? Willa asked. You'll know when you get to the top. Ingund rummaged in the pockets of her coat and produced a small dagger. Its hilt was made of gold, but it didn't look very sharp. Remember your promise. I can't kill a dragon with that. Willa said, horrified. Yes you can, Ingund said. Trust me. My brother was a blacksmith, and an armorer by profession. He made this as a failsafe, but never used it. Its magic will reveal itself when you need it. What about Aberlin? Who was going to save him, if she was going up that ladder to tickle Amberflame with a blunt butter knife and get herself killed? He'll be there, and he'll need you. Willa shook her head in disbelief and tried to hand the dagger back to Ingund, furious with herself for having let the old woman talk her into this. Ingund refused the blade. Jacob is dead because he didn't have this. You knew Jacob was going after Amberflame? No. I should have guessed he would at some stage, but it's hard to tell someone you love the truth when you know it's going to cause them a world of pain. This, Willa could relate to. She'd been lying to everyone she loved since summer. But she needed to know what to expect. Let's assume I agree to go up this ladder. What will I find up there? The answer to all your questions and to our mutual problem. Willa lowered the lamp and closed her eyes for a moment, considering her options. When she opened them again, Ingund was gone. She had two choices now. She could go up the ladder, armed with a short, blunt blade and either talk Abelin out of going after the dragon, or attempt to find and kill Amberflame with it, depending on what was up there. Or she could go back the way she'd come and try to extract more information from Ingund, but what good would that do? The woman had obviously gone mad. The flame in the oil lamp flared up one last time and then died, leaving Willa in total blackness. She shook the decrepit metal vessel, as if to confirm to herself that the oil was all used up, and when she didn't hear a single splash, she set it down. For lack of anywhere else to put the dagger, she tucked the useless thing into her sleeve. Then she felt around for the ladder, trying to tell herself that it wasn't a terribly difficult climb. She grabbed hold and started putting one foot above the other, one rung at a time, very carefully at first, and then increasingly quicker. Halfway up, a wooden tread broke beneath her foot. Her cold slippery hands barely found purchase and she almost plummeted, but managed to haul herself up again and continue climbing. It seemed like the ladder would go on forever, and she was so exhausted by the time she reached the ledge at the top, she trembled like a leaf. Gasping for air, she lay there flat on her stomach for a moment, until a thin sliver of light caught her eye just a few feet ahead. It was almost too good to be true. She moved toward it on all fours and discovered that it came from a gap at the bottom of a door. A way out? Cautiously, she stood and searched for a knob or a handle. There didn't seem to be one, but there was a soft murmur of voices on the other side. She pressed her ear to the wooden panel. Two people were talking. They were moving around, and she could only hear them when they were close to the wall. "Looking for you? What are you doing up here?" a man's voice asked. The other voice replied, but Willa didn't understand what it was saying. "I have to do this," the man said, and Willa recognized him as Abelin. "No. I forbid it," the other voice said, rising in pitch. "You don't know what you're doing." It was a woman. "I'm not stupid." Abelin scoffed. "I know what killing Amberflame would mean for the Vales. Both sides of it. But it has to be done. There's no way you can win. You can't kill a dragon. Not without magic. I may not have magic, but I do have a good sword. No. I'm not going to lose you too. But I'm not Jacob. I'm not keeping this from you. Not doing it because I want to go down in history as a dragon slayer. The woman I love is going to die if I don't kill the beast. You don't know what love is." The woman's voice was close to panic. "I know that your own grandfather was a commoner from Alderbark, so you of all people should understand." There was another silence, and then the woman said something Willa couldn't hear. Furious, Abelin replied, "I know where Amberflame is going to be tonight, and I will kill her to save Willa." "Don't do this," the female voice implored him, distraught. "You'll die, and everyone in Alderbark will pay the price, your Willa included." Once again, Willa frantically searched the panel for a latch of some kind, anything to open its lock. "They've already paid enough. We all have. Please give me your blessing, Mother." but the woman couldn't bring herself to. A door slammed, and Lady Galinda sobbed. Willa launched herself at the panel that was keeping her from Aberlin and tried to force it, pitting every last bit of strength she had left against it. She had to talk to him, before he left the grounds, and tell him she didn't want him to take on the monster. Not for her. Her feet started slipping on the sandy gravel that covered the ledge, and she groped around for something to hold on to. Her fingers wrapped around a short wooden lever that protruded from the wall left of the door. It snapped down, releasing the lock as she stumbled forward, headlong out of the shaft's exit. "Who's there?" Galinda cried out, spinning around, but Willa was already back on her feet and blinking at the sudden onslaught of daylight in her eyes, even if there was precious little left of it. Angry leaden clouds coursed across the open sky above them, and Willa realized she wasn't at Alderbark Castle at all, but at the siege castle just across from the stronghold. It had been built during a war at a time when there had been no dragon to protect the Vales. The smaller structure had mostly fallen to ruin over the centuries, but the keep still stood, and here she was, face to face on its rooftop with Lady Galinda. "What are you doing here?" the older woman asked, aghast. "No one knows about the passageway." "Never mind," Willa said, carelessly brushing strands of matted hair from her face. "I have to talk to Aberlin." She ran the length of the battlements, looking down, trying to locate him. He couldn't have gotten too far yet. She called out to him, but didn't think he'd hear. Not with the fierce wind that howled around the parapets and the rain that was setting in. The sun sank relentlessly toward the horizon, and it got darker by the second. Galinda seized her arm. "You're Willa." Willa looked straight at the woman who'd given Aberlin life, and really saw her for the first time. Then she understood. Within 1 second, Galinda's eyes flashed from deep blue to emerald green and back. There was a wild, uncontrollable fire in them, something ancient and fascinating that could easily spread, and Willa recoiled as the irises shifted back and forth between a perfect round shape and a serpentine slit. Galinda's face also began changing, at first, only on the surface. Soft, human skin sprouted delicate red scales around her nose and eyes. After a moment, the bone structure beneath began shifting. The transition seemed to be causing her pain, and she released Willa. Clasping her hands over her face, she turned away, but Willa saw that her slender fingers had become long gnarly claws. "Go," Galinda yelled, her voice hoarse and desperate. "I won't recognize him. I won't recognize anyone." Willa felt like she was suspended in time as the beautiful woman she knew as the Lady of Alderbark slowly but surely turned into the monster of the Vales, growing in size and unfurling wings that ripped through the back of her already tattered dress. Galinda was Amberflame. Ingund had told her the truth. She was human by day. But even so, how was she supposed to kill her? "Go," Galinda screamed again, putting as much distance as possible between herself and Willa. "Run." Panicked, Willa bolted for the door that led downward into the keep, but when she opened it, Aberlin came charging out, nearly bowling her over. At the same time, the dagger Ingund had given her slipped from her sleeve and clattered to the floor. He had heard her. Emerald eyes wide, the form changer spun around and stared first at her son, and then at the dagger. Harried and confused, Aberlin put himself between Willa and the beast. "Stay behind me," he yelled. There was no trace left of Galinda in the dragon's eyes, and she roared and struck out at him, tearing into his chest. Blood spurted from the wound, and he staggered backward, crashing into Willa. All Willa could do for him was break his fall and let him slide gently to the floor. The wound in his chest was deep, and she knew he wouldn't be able to stand up. He was in shock, and he probably wouldn't know what she was saying, but she bent to his ear anyway. "Hold on, my love," she whispered, and retrieved the dagger from the ground beside him. It was better than nothing, and she wouldn't die or let Aberlin die without a fight. A sudden break in the clouds seemed to loosen the dragon's hold over the soul that dwelled in the beast's body. The extra light slowed the change to a halt, trapping her between phases. Blue eyes fixed on the bleeding body on the ground, the monster howled, throwing its head back in human anguish. The metal hilt of the dagger felt warm in Willa's hands, and she nearly dropped it when it began to quiver and glow. An almost liquid luminescence emitted from the golden grip, sheathing the useless iron blade in a transparent silvery substance that extended it to a good 4 feet in length. She waved it several times, testing it, though she hardly had any idea what to do with it. It felt so light, she doubted it would cause the creature before her much damage, but she had as little knowledge of magic as she did of sword fighting, and there was clearly some sort of sorcery at work here, so she had nothing to lose. Her instincts told her to go with it. Without another thought, she lunged at the form changer, who was neither completely dragon nor woman anymore. Amberflame did not see her coming. In one swift motion, Willa thrust the glowing silver blade upward, deep into the underside of her chin. The howling instantly stopped, and the form changer stilled. Willa tugged the blade free, and Amberflame's dead weight fell backward over the battlements, crashing to the ground below. Willa didn't have to see the lifeless body to know the monster was dead. She dropped the sword. It stopped buzzing the second she let go of it and reverted back to a useless dagger. Aberlin lay where she'd left him. She fell to her knees beside him in a puddle of rainwater and blood, bent over him, and cupped his face in her hands, silently begging him to still be alive. His eyelids fluttered open, but he looked right through her. "Don't leave me," she said, caressing his cheeks. "We're free. The dragon is dead. We can leave this place and be together." Aberlin's eyes cleared, and he seemed to focus. She smiled. He raised a blood-smeared hand to her face and awkwardly stroked her skin. His fingers were cold. "I was such a fool," he said with great effort. "I didn't see what was right in front of me." "It's not your fault, you couldn't have known." Heavy rain pelted down on them, and she briefly wondered if Emmanuel had been aware. How could he not have been, when England had? The crone's brother had been Galinda's grandfather. "We were happy," he said between shallow breaths, and suddenly she understood that love didn't just make you blind and deaf. It could render you completely helpless. She couldn't justify what Emmanuel had risked and sacrificed, or the secret England had kept, but she understood. "We were," she said, not daring to move. She kept her gaze fixed to his, holding their connection until the light in his eyes faded and died. Then she shattered, and she cried. That night, the people of Tannenberg sent a small party to accompany a frightened, gangly boy of 17 to Alimentlot. When the dragon didn't come, they took him home again, leaving half a pig, 5 hares, 2 baskets of parsnips, a large hamper of freshly baked bread, and a pile of warm blankets. Arthur Tice distributed the goods among the survivors of the attack and the families who took them in. Ingen suffered a fatal stroke in the early hours of Christmas Day, and in January, a new midwife took up residence in Alderbach. In the spring, Tannenberg sent 10 men to help rebuild the houses that had been destroyed. It took them all summer, and by the time they finished the hunting cabin, Willa's baby had been born. Emmanuel came by to see the child only once, asking if it was a girl. Willa was sure he would have taken her back to the castle with him if it had been. Perhaps he would have raised her as his own. Perhaps he'd have drowned her instead. But it was a boy, and he seemed greatly relieved. He gifted the cottage in the woods to her, and she never saw him again. The years went by, and Emmanuel passed away, leaving the castle to abandonment without a legitimate heir. The king no longer had an interest in its upkeep, and wind and weather wore away at the structure until the glass in the windows broke, the roofs collapsed, and weeds and brambles took over the great hall. Eventually, even the dragon was forgotten by most, but every year in December for as long as she lived, Willa lit 3 candles in the window of her home so she would remember her time with Aberlin. When Willa, too, passed away, the little cottage stood empty for a long, long time. Every night in the weeks before Christmas, her great-granddaughter, the first girl to be born in her family for 90 years, would look out across the valley from her parents' house and see 3 lights in its window, and her deep blue eyes would shine emerald green just for a fraction of a second. You've been listening to Amberflame. Text copyright by Elizabeth Hofmann for Lag 2019, audio copyright 2021. If you enjoyed this short story, please remember to leave an honest review at your retail platform or on Goodreads. Authors appreciate your feedback. You can visit the author's homepage at www.lisahoffman.net. Novels available by Lisa Hofmann for ebook readers and in paperback, from the Desiree series, Book 1, Stealing the Light. Book 2, Into the Dark. Book 3, Gates of Eventide. Trading Darkness. A Dark Fairy Tale. Other short stories available for ebook readers and in paperback: Amelie, a magical shapeshifter story. Aura, a thrilling shapeshifter mystery. Artemis Wings, an enchanting shapeshifter love story.